Hi, everybody, and welcome to Big Joe's Journal. My name is Joe Tilden, and I want to take this occasion to wish everybody a very, very happy New Year. And as we begin the year 2020, and it's hard to believe that we're up that far and up that high, it's going to be a year that is going to make history in this country and the world. This year, we have the opportunity to correct the mistake we made back in 2016. And I think the importance of this election is to determine what kind of democracy we're going to have. Certainly, it would be a huge, huge mistake to re-elect the current administration. I mean, they've showed their inability to govern, their inability to lead, making dumb decisions. We're losing our role of leadership in the world. We more or less surrendered the Pacific Theater to China. And China's building, they're even now expanding their Navy, building some aircraft carriers. Russia is moving ahead, improving their weapons system. North Korea, they're more or less laughing at us. They're still testing their rockets. And the possibility that they may have a nuclear-tipped missile that they can fire from their little peninsula over into the continental United States, but probably not the lower 48 at first. I think they would try Alaska. Alaska's a little bit closer. And they might try launching a few into Alaska, which would get us into a war. The situation in Iran. Now, I think they made the right decision when they showed the Iranians that we were going to stand back and have our people killed without retaliation. But in a way, it's rather hypocritical, because the Saudis, Saudi Arabia, our so-called ally, you have to remember that they kidnapped an American citizen and then butchered him. And we did nothing. We gave him a free ride. The clown we have in the White House asked the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, "Do you have anything to do with this?" He said, "Nope." Bald-faced lie. Professional liar in the White House brought into it. And we did no retaliation against Saudi Arabia for kidnapping and butchering an American citizen. Well, Saudi Arabia had if you will, a showcase trial where they convicted 5 people that probably had nothing to do with the deal to begin with, put them to death and say, "Hey, look, we looked at it, and these guys were responsible." And, well, we know that's a blatant lie. We did the right thing in retaliating with Iran. But it's rather hypocritical if we're going to retaliate against one nation for killing an American citizen and give another nation that not only kidnapped but also butchered them a free ride. It's totally hypocritical. But then this is the whole Trump administration. Look at our Kurdish allies that helped us crush ISIS and how we ran out on them. Allowed Turkey to move in, Russia, Serbia, to move in and take over that Kurdish territory. Left our allies high and dry. And on and on and on it goes. Also, as we begin this show this week, the Vermont State Legislature goes back into session, and they'll be looking at one of the big items is health care, also parental leave, and increasing the minimum wage in Vermont over a period of time. And we'll see how that goes and whether the governor vetoes it. But with the one-sidedness of the legislature, they should have no problem overriding that veto. On the national scene, the impeachment of the president is a fact. And of course, his trial in the Senate will take place Who knows? Whether it'll be right off or whether it'll be later on. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is holding the articles of impeachment and has not turned them over to the Senate yet until she is assured that the hearing in the Senate will resemble some sense of fairness. The Democrats would like a number of witnesses to testify, witnesses that were in on the little Trump collaboration to withhold weapons from one of our allies who is currently in a shooting war with Russia and taking casualties and need help. And of course, the whole idea, we're going to withhold weapons from them. You kind of wonder who's calling the shots. We know that the current incumbent of the White House is Mr. Putin's puppet. Putin is not only the president of Russia, he also has a very strong say in what goes on in the United States. In Israel, the Israeli Prime Minister, Netanyahu, may be winding up in jail. He has been charged with a number of crimes. And Israel, of course, is one of our staunchest allies in the Near East. And that should be settled this year. The Israelis are having another election, I believe it's their third in less than a year, to see if one party or another can't get a majority in the Knesset, which is like our Congress. And the party that has the majority elects the prime minister. The office of, excuse me, I'm having a lot of trouble here today. The office of President of Israel is more of a ceremonial one. The prime minister is actually the head of state, much the same as in the United Kingdom, where the prime minister is the real head of state. The queen and all the royal family and all the other freeloaders are merely figureheads. Well, as we move into the 2020s, all kinds of challenges. And the importance of this year, I think it's going to kick off in Iowa. And then, of course, it moves to New Hampshire, where we're going to be having the primaries. And then I believe it's into South Carolina and then to Nevada, if I'm not mistaken. So it gets off early in February, and the big race will be underway. And as I said before, the important thing for the Democrats, and there are a number of them still in the running, some have dropped out, is to get a united ticket that is going to get people to vote. And let's clean up the mess in Washington. Let's get rid of those idiots that are running government now. Get them out of there. And the Senate side, that would include sending Mitch McConnell back to Kentucky and leaving him there. And let's get the government doing the job that they're supposed to do. There are so many bills waiting to be acted on in the Senate that it's unbelievable that McConnell is held up for one reason or another. Well, one reason, of course, is to protect his wife, who's the Secretary of Transportation. Seems that she's been mishandling a few federal funds, somewhere in the millions. And he wants to protect her, and to do that, he's got to stay an ally of the big crook in the White House and some of his cronies. But this is the opportunity for the country to get things right. To do that, everybody's got to turn out and vote. And that's why the Democrats got to put a ticket together that's going to be strong enough to dump Trump, and that's going to reunite the country. The person to do that is the former Vice President Joe Biden. He has the ability to reach across the aisle, as we say. He has the ability to reunite the country. He should be the Democratic nominee. And it's time for these other folks that are seeking the nomination, like Bernie and Senator Warren, and the former mayor of New York, and Tom Sayer from California, who's a millionaire, to come together, to coalesce, come together, support Biden for president, and then the big choice will be his running mate. And in my opinion, there are two excellent choices. My first choice would be the junior senator from California, and that's Kamala Harris. Joe Biden will probably only be 4 years, one term. And the chances are very good that his vice president would succeed him. And it's just a matter of time before we have a female vice president. And I think the best one qualified for that would be Kamala Harris. I think she should be the first choice to be Joe Biden's running mate. After that, I think the former Secretary of Housing from San Antonio, Texas, Mr. Castro, would be a very good running mate. The Democrats to win, they need the African American vote. They need the women's vote, first of all. They should have that. Any woman that votes for Donald Trump, there's something wrong with her. But they need the female vote. They need the African American vote. They need the Hispanic vote. And with Joe Biden, I think they got a darn good chance of getting back the labor vote. They didn't believe Hillary Clinton 4 years ago and mistakenly fell for Trump's lies and voted him in. Now, the economy is doing very well. But why is it doing well? It's doing well because the way we were pulled out of recession in the Obama administration, and Obama's administration set up the tools and the reasons why the economy is doing well. And it's doing well because of the work of the Obama administration, not the Trump administration. Trump administration, by imposing all these tariffs and everything else, cutting us off from the rest of the world, is heading us into what could be, if it continued for another 4 years, a very deep recession and even a depression. The liar-in-chief, come a year from now, he should be packing his bags and moving out of the White House and moving down to Florida permanently. I know they don't want him back in New York, and he probably doesn't want to go to New York because his income taxes will be up for scrutiny by the federal court, and he could be the first, first commander-in-chief to be the first inmate and not a chief. So we'll see what happens there. Well, one thing I want to talk about, and that is turning the clock back a bit, and that's back to this past Christmas, and something I do every Christmas that I didn't do this year because of weather conditions and so forth. But let's talk about the birth of Christ. First of all, nobody really knows when Christ was actually born. But every indication is that it was in the spring, probably late March, early April, when Christ was born. The four gospel writers, of the four, only two knew Jesus as a person. And they knew him when he was 30 years old, not when he was an infant. That was Matthew and John. Mark, who was I believe, a physician by trade, never knew Jesus at all. He may have seen him, possibly, but he did not know him. And Luke, of course, was Gentile. And Luke never saw Jesus, or never knew him. These are your four gospel writers. And we read most of what we know about Christmas comes from the Gospel of Luke. He does not specify what time of year that Jesus was born, but he does mention, first of all, the fact that Joseph and Mary had to go from their home in Nazareth to Joseph's family home in Bethlehem to register. Now, the Romans, in building up their empire, of course, weren't stupid. So when they're going to take a census And the purpose of a census, of course, was for taxation. In order for them to occupy as much of the world as they did, and to have a standing army that would keep things under control, they had to pay them. Well, the only way you're going to pay them is through taxes. And the only way you're going to know how to set taxes is by every so often taking a census, as we're going to be doing in this country in 2020. Every 10 years we take a census here. It determines the number of seats each geographical region has in the White House, or in the House of Representatives. And it also takes in income tax levels and so forth. It's for taxation purposes primarily. And the same thing with the Romans. That's where our founding fathers got this idea, from the early Romans. And they would have a period of taxation when all elements of the empire could get there. For example, they're not going to have it in winter, when winter is hitting Northern Europe rather hard. Those people can't get to where they're supposed to go to register. They aren't going to have it in the middle of summer because of the heat in Africa. They're going to have it at a time when it's convenient for everybody to go where they're supposed to go and register and be counted in the census. And this would be in the spring. And we know, primarily from Luke, that it came time for the census that had to be taken. So Joseph, they take the means of transportation then, of course, was by donkey. His wife was very pregnant, puts her on a donkey, and they head from Nazareth, they head south. They're going down to Bethlehem, which is south of Jerusalem. Nazareth is in Galilee, north of Jerusalem. And Joseph, of course, he has his long walking stick, if you will. And Mary, being very pregnant, would be riding on the donkey. So because this census took place in the spring, it's a pretty good chance that that's when Jesus was born. They get down to Bethlehem, and Joseph's family was rather large. He was of the family of King David, whose home was Bethlehem, which is why he had to go there to register. So the chances are that tourist accommodations are not that big in that town. And the folks that have come there, everything is pretty well filled up. So they go to the inn, and Joseph, being a carpenter and not being wealthy, they were rather poor. First of all, chances are he couldn't afford a room in the inn. Second of all, it's probably already full to begin with. So the innkeeper says, well, at a reduced price, I got a cave or a stable down back here, and you're welcome to occupy that. Consequently, Joseph needs an accommodation. His wife is due. And they go down there. And that's where the Christ child is born. Well, Joseph takes a feeding trough that was probably used to feed sheep and the other animals that are housed down there. And by tradition, would probably put a little straw in there and then put some kind of a cloth over it. Christ child is born. That's where he'd be laid. And it's rather interesting that of all God's creatures, the first ones to greet him when he came to earth in the form of a human, besides his parents, were his four-legged creatures. The sheep, donkeys, maybe a camel or two from a wealthier guest staying at the hotel. And thus, the nativity that we celebrate today took place. Well, why do we celebrate it in December? Well, as I said before, well, let's backtrack a little bit. At that time, the calendar that the Roman world was operating under was the Julian calendar. It consisted of 10 months. The first 6 months were named after Roman gods, Roman pagan gods. When he got to the 7th month, he couldn't think of any other names. So he said, well, let's call it the 7th month. Septem is 7 in Latin, so we have September. Octo is 8, October. Novem is 9, November. Decem is 10, December. And there was your Roman calendar. Incidentally, if we were still operating under the Roman calendar, and we were celebrating Christmas under the Roman calendar, Christmas would be January 7th, which happens to be, I'm taping this show on the 6th, so Christmas under the old Julian calendar would have been tomorrow. This would have been Christmas Eve. How about that, huh? Well, at the end of the year, with winter coming on, the Romans held a big celebration. It was called Saturnalia. It was named in honor of the god Saturn, who was the patron of light. And at that time, that part of the year, it was time for feasting and celebration. It was time for bright lights. People would color their lights and all that. They didn't have electricity then, but they had oil. Mainly came from fish oil and stuff like that. That's what they could, fire their fire and have their candle lights. And they colored them and had a big celebration. It was also a time to consider the less fortunate in the Roman Empire, something we still do today. And for the early Christians, they could not, of course, honor a pagan god, Saturn. To do so would have been a violation of their faith, and failure to do so meant probably execution. So as they huddled in the catacombs, which were tunnels and hiding places within the earth, they had to find a reason to celebrate Saturnalia, some joyful occasion. They could celebrate the bright lights and so forth and so on, and a lot of drinking, a lot of carousing going on. Well, they could celebrate the bright lights. I don't know about the rest of it. But they had to have some other reason to celebrate. And so they said, well, we do not know when Christ was born. We don't know when Christ was born. Why don't we take this feast, and we'll take this feast of Saturnalia, the Feast of Light, and we'll say Christ was born, and this is when we will celebrate his nativity. And that is why we have Christmas in December. And this pattern continued. Well, of course, 315, as you know, Constantine I became the Roman emperor. And his mother was a Christian. And Constantine, while himself never became a Christian, he ended the persecution of Christians. In the year 315, the Edict of Milan ended the persecution of Christians and gave them equal rights with the pagans in the Roman Empire. In the year 505, Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great, he had been a monk, and he was also a scientist. And by exploring different things that scientists explore and all that sort of thing, he concluded that the Julian calendar was not correct. And he devised a calendar of 365 and 1/4 days. Well, he also decided to break up the calendar and to go from 10 months to 12 months. So he set up a calendar that had 7 months of 31 days, 4 months of 30 days, and 1 month where 3 years would have 28 days. But on the 4th year, leap year, it'd be a 29th day. That would accommodate for all the quarter days of the quarter days of the 3 years plus the one of the leap year. And so the Gregorian calendar is the one we use today. And the way it was set up, he kept the first 6 months, and then instead of tacking on 2 more months at the end, he put them in the middle. So the 7th month, instead of becoming September, was named in honor of Julius Caesar, the month of July. And that was 31 days. A second month of 31 days was squeezed in between July and September, and that was named in honor of Augustus Caesar. And what was the 7th month became the 9th, our September. It was the 9th, or rather the 7th became the 9th, the 8th became the 10th, the 9th became the 11th, the 10th became the 12th. The calendar we have today, the calendar that we use pretty much in Europe and over here in the North and South America. In China, of course, they use a different calendar. In Japan, they use a different calendar. But in most of the English and French-speaking world, and in Africa, we have adopted the Gregorian calendar as the calendar we use today. The result is that this year is leap year. That means this is the year February has 29 days. Well, as Gregory brought his calendar into focus and the world adopted it, everything was set up where Christ's birth would be celebrated the end of the year, December, and we'd begin the new year, January and so forth, as we're doing now. And everything was set up on this Gregorian calendar. But as scientists have looked at this situation more and more, and historians, archaeologists, it seems to be a pretty good conclusion that the Christ child came into the world probably the end of March, more likely the first part of April. And I have a theory, and that's a personal theory, and I will never know whether it's true or not until the day I die, and I'm fortunate enough to go up instead of down. But I have a theory that Christ was born, and he was either crucified or he rose from the dead on the same day, 33 years apart. It's just a theory I have. And I don't know how it's going to play out, but we'll just have to wait and see. But over the years, of course, this Christmas started off as a small celebration in the catacombs. As Christianity more or less became a state religion, as the Roman Empire slowly deteriorated and then eventually split, this has become accepted. And it's the calendar we live by and the calendar under. And all the customs that we have developed. It was St. Francis of Assisi that invented the Christmas creche. You know, that is where you have the little stable and the little statues that resemble Joseph and Mary and the Christ child and the sheep and camels and the shepherds. That's another indication that Christ was born in the spring. Had he been born in the middle of winter, the sheep would have been in the barn. But the fact that they were out in the pastures and they had shepherds out watching, and according to Luke, they were alerted by the angels and they went and adored the Christ child. Well, if it had been in December, shepherds would have been unemployed. They might have been doing other jobs, or they might have been celebrating, you know, knocking down a few and so forth and so on. But they were working, which is another sign it was in the spring and not in early winter. But customs have come down through the years. We have Santa Claus, St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas was a bishop in Turkey. And the word is that among his parishioners, if you will, was a man with three daughters who was very poor. And in those days, of course, as you know, women were considered the property of their husbands. And they had to bring a dowry. In other words, the father of the bride had to pay the groom or the groom's family for taking his daughter off his hands. Well, this poor guy, he had 3 daughters, didn't have enough money to come up with a dowry. And the word is that St. Nicholas put together 3 bags of gold, and at night he snuck into their house and dropped off the 3 bags of gold, and the father said, "Oh boy." There he had his dowry, and he was able to pay off the dowry and unload his 3 daughters. Well, of course, St. Nicholas, this custom was adopted in Germany. Another custom came out of Germany was a Christmas tree. The German pagan belief was that, that trees had a godlike power. And since I've run out of time, maybe I'll finish a little bit of this next week. With that, may Almighty God in His wisdom continue to bless these United States of America. God love you. Have a great week and Happy New Year.